The trade war continues between the world's two largest economies, and it appears the war is spilling over to currency now. The U.S. has proposed imposing anti-subsidy duties on goods from countries that undervalue their currencies last week, and today it has listed South Korea along with China as countries that need monitoring for currency manipulation. Today we go in depth with Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea, on whether all this is a prelude to a possible currency war. Thank you for coming in today.
Happy to be here.
So the U.S. Treasury's currency report came out a bit later than expected, and it has listed South Korea on its monitoring list for currency manipulation. Why?
Well, first of all, we need to talk about the standards of how they determine whether you're going to be on the list or not. And that standard has changed a little bit with this particular report. Previously, the United States looked only at its 12 largest trading partners. Now they're looking at all trading partners which have bilateral trade with the United States over $40 billion. So that includes, from the U.S. point of view, both exports plus imports. So they're dealing with more countries now. They're dealing with this report, 21 countries rather than 12. And then the three criteria that they used, they also changed a bit. The first criteria is that a country must have a bilateral trade surplus with the United States over $20 billion. That has not changed. Then second criteria is that the current account surplus in that country has to be over 3% of the GDP. This was the old criteria. They strengthened this criteria to 2% of GDP. So now it's easier to get on that watch list. And then the third criteria is that the country has to have one-sided intervention, and that intervention has to be over 2% of the GDP over. Previously, this was 8 to 12 months, but now it's 6 to 12 months, so they lengthened the period that they're looking at. So overall, they made it a bit easier for a country to get on that list. Now, having said that, Korea only fulfills one of the three criteria, which is that Korea has a current account surplus over 2% of GDP. Korea's bilateral trade surplus with the United States fell below $20 billion this year. It's last year, so it's only $18 billion. And Korea has never intervened in the market to a degree over 2 or 3% of the GDP. So at least according to the report, Korea will be dropped from the watch list if Korea only fulfills one of the three criteria again in the next report.
Amid the ongoing U.S. China trade war, the U.S. did not designate China as a currency manipulator. Could this be part of Washington's attempt to perhaps prevent its relations with China from getting worse?
Well, it's pretty hard to label China as a currency manipulator, at least according to the present numbers. We mentioned the three criteria earlier. China currently only fulfills one of that three criteria. China has a very large trade surplus with the United States, and then academically, places like IMF or various professors calculate whether the exchange rate is stronger or weaker than it should be. Now, there's a lot of controversy because there's no one set way of measuring what is the appropriate exchange rate. But most of these reports do agree that while you can make a case that China undervalued its currency after the global financial crisis, perhaps about 2008 to about 2014, but currently you cannot make the case that China's RMB is undervalued. So if the United States accused China of being a currency manipulator, they will have somewhat of a hard case making their point. Now, having said that, though, the trade war is worsening, and for the last 6 months or so, the RMB has been weakening. Not necessarily because of the government intervention, but because partially because of the trade war, partially because of the weakening Chinese economy. Foreign investment has been leaving China. So they might bring the case up again because the RMB has been weakening quite quickly in the last 6 months or so.
The U.S. recently proposed to impose anti-subsidy duties on goods from countries that undervalue their currencies, and of course this mostly aims at China. But China argues that, as you've mentioned, the Chinese yuan's depreciation is a market response, is a market reaction to Washington's unilateral tariff hike. Do you agree?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics, right now the devaluation of the RMB is driven by more of an international finance aspect than the trade aspect. And that's actually mostly always the case. In the short run and even in the medium run, it's the investment movement, movement into the stock market or direct investment, which has the largest effect on the exchange rate. And I think the main reason why the RMB is depreciating currently is because, well, partially because of the trade war, partially because Chinese exports have been falling for reasons other than the trade war, for example, the slowing global economy, and because the domestic Chinese economy also seems to be weakening. The investment there is just not as attractive. So from a foreigner's point of view, less investment into China. From China's point of view, more investment going out of China. And I think that's the main culprit in driving down the exchange rate, which brings up a problem because, well, this currency report, it concentrates on trade rather than investment. And those having an open capital flow, open international investment, and satisfying the United States on these type of foreign exchange rate issues, they might become incompatible.
Now, if the U.S. begins to slap duties, the anti-subsidy duties on goods from countries that undervalue their currencies, would that affect the South Korean economy?
I think Korea is in some ways more vulnerable. And the reason that the United States is continuing to attack China is because China forms so much of the U.S. trade deficit. But as I mentioned before, if you talk with people academically, then there's no real case to show that the RMB is undervalued. On the other hand, IMF has claimed for the last 2 or 3 years that Korean won is undervalued. And some other academic studies have also claimed that Korean won is undervalued. So if we just talk about the level of foreign exchange rate, then Korea may be even more vulnerable than China for these type of anti-subsidy tariffs. Having said that, though, there's no set way of measuring what is the ideal rate of exchange rate. And these things also tend to be driven a lot by temporary movements in international investment. If the United States does make a case that Korean won is undervalued, it's going to be very hard for them to prove, but also it's going to be very hard for us to prove otherwise. So it'll cause a lot of problems, not only for Korea, but for international trade in general, because right now the WTO rules does not cover subsidies or tariffs dealing with exchange rates. In fact, the WTO, I think, deliberately stayed away from the issue when it was created because this was just too complicated. And now they're bringing it back into the picture. If the United States does bring in the anti-exchange rate tariffs, then I think it's going to cause a lot of problems in the global international trading rules.
As you've mentioned, it's hard to prove that one country is undervaluing its currency. And if the U.S. really goes ahead and slaps anti-subsidy duties on goods from countries that undervalue their currencies, then the fallout will be immense. Then do you think the U.S. will go ahead and actually begin slapping anti-subsidy duties anyway?
I think it's a possibility. The reason I'm saying that is because I think, well, most specialists in international trade recognizes that finding the ideal level of exchange rate is impossible. So they're willing to just overlook a lot of these problems. But there has been a lot of political problems in the U.S. dealing with exchange rates. The U.S. Congress, as well as a lot of labor unions and the businesses as well, they've all been complaining about undervaluation of the currency since 2008. So there might be enough political pressure that they might want to use this not only as a tool for negotiations, but actual tariffs. Having said that, though, I think there's also a lot of politicians, a lot of congressmen who recognize that this will cause a lot of earthquake in the global trading rules. So they might refrain from actually using the tariffs instead of just using it as a negotiation tool. But with President Trump, you never quite know which way he's going to jump.
So for the time being, we'll have to sit and watch how that plays out on that front. Now, Washington has blacklisted Chinese tech giant Huawei, and now it's reportedly targeting China's other high-tech industries. Reports suggest Washington is mulling to blacklist a couple of Chinese firms in the fields of surveillance technology, artificial intelligence, as well as robots. It looks like the U.S. is raising its stakes, despite the possibility of it, despite the fact that it could harm its own companies and consumers. Why is the U.S. going that far?
Well, President Trump's trade policy really has ignored the effect on consumer to a lot of degree. Recent studies have shown that the tariffs on Chinese goods are hitting mostly U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers. It's just that you don't feel it as much because U.S. economy right now is so strong. Having said that, though, this will definitely affect the U.S. consumers, but I think there's a lot of consensus among politicians as well as businessmen and unions that China has to be dealt with. That's the first problem. And then there's a lot of things being mentioned currently about technological leadership. Huawei has almost reached the levels of companies IT companies in the United States, Apple, Samsung, Oracle, and so on. So a lot of people are concerned that if Huawei continues to grow as it is, then they might take technological leadership over the United States. So a lot of people are concerned about that as well. And then there's also some defense-related people are concerned that Huawei equipment can be used to spy on American communications. That's a lot more controversial, but Huawei is saying that they don't have any type of technological backdoors that they can spy on, but Huawei did have some close relationship with Chinese military in the past, so there's some cause for suspicion perhaps, but not all countries are concerned about that. Australia, New Zealand, Japan are some of the countries just siding with the United States and not using Huawei equipment, but European countries such as Germany, France, and UK partially as well, they're saying that they will continue to use Huawei equipment. And President Trump has been sort of undercutting his own argument a little bit because he's saying that any policies dealing with Huawei can be made part of the trade deal. And well, if the national security and technology issue was so important, then I'm not sure if he would want to make it a part of the trade deal. So in some sense, President Trump is cutting down his own argument, but still, I think the consumers are sort of being ignored right now, and the consumers are not really feeling it because the U.S. economy, for other reasons, are so strong right now.
Now, one last question for you. Well, multiple sources suggest that major Korean firms such as Samsung and LG, they have no immediate plans to suspend business with Huawei. What do you think would be a wise strategy for South Korean firms at this point?
Okay, I would keep an eye out on what France, Germany, and UK is going to do. If those companies also fall under pressure of the United States, or they find legitimate reasons that Huawei is really building backdoors into their equipment, then Korea will probably have no choice but to follow their lead. But as long as they're not following the U.S. lead, I think Korean firms do have justification for not following the U.S. lead as well. So basically, keep an eye out for what the other countries are doing and use this time period for changing the suppliers if they can.
All right, Dr. Yang, thank you as always for your thorough analysis.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching.